Yeah, we were competitive, yeah. Not openly, but we later admitted, yeah, so Paul's written a good one there, I better get going. And I would similarly, that's a bit good, right, here we go, come on.
At 82 years old, Paul McCartney finally said something that quietly rewrote music history. For decades, fans believed the same story, that Paul was the one who ended the Beatles. It became accepted truth, repeated so often it stopped being questioned. But Paul's recent words suggest something far more complicated and far more uncomfortable. According to him, the breakup wasn't a dramatic explosion or a single argument. It was a slow collapse, driven by pressure most fans never saw. Contracts, control, and decisions happening behind closed doors. What makes this revelation so powerful isn't just what he said, but when he said it. Paul had nothing left to gain and nothing left to protect. And that's what makes this moment different. Because once you strip away nostalgia and blame, a very different story emerges. One where music took a backseat to business and friendship became collateral damage. And that was only the beginning. For more than 50 years, the narrative felt settled. Paul was blamed because he spoke first. When he announced his departure in 1970, headlines didn't ask questions, they assigned guilt. Fans saw leadership as control and control as betrayal. Meanwhile, the real sequence of events stayed buried. What most people didn't realize is that decisions had already been made long before Paul ever went public. Private conversations had happened, lines had already been crossed, but silence was strategically maintained because money, contracts, and lawsuits were looming. The truth didn't disappear, it was delayed, and the delay allowed a myth to harden into fact. Over time, repetition turned assumption into history. But myths only survive when no one challenges them. And now, decades later, that challenge has finally arrived. By the late 1960s, the Beatles weren't just a band, they were a global business machine. Albums, touring, publishing rights, merchandising, film projects, every move involved enormous financial stakes. What once felt like four friends making music had transformed into a corporation generating millions. Every creative decision now carried legal consequences. Every disagreement affected revenue streams. Success had quietly changed the rules. The band that once thrived on instinct now had to answer to contracts. And none of them were trained for that reality. As the business grew more complex, so did the tension. The question was no longer, what sounds good? It became, who controls what? And that shift planted the seeds of distrust that would eventually tear everything apart. That pressure might have been survivable if one person hadn't been lost. Brian Epstein wasn't just a manager, he was the buffer between creativity and chaos. Epstein handled disputes, smoothed egos, negotiated deals, and made sure business never poisoned the band's relationships. When problems surfaced, he absorbed them. When conflicts arose, he diffused them quietly. His death in 1967 didn't just leave the band grieving, it left them exposed. Suddenly, there was no neutral voice, no final authority, no one to say no. And without Epstein, decisions that once felt simple became battlegrounds. The structure holding the empire together vanished overnight. After Epstein's death, everything changed. But slowly enough that fans barely noticed. Meetings became arguments. Trust gave way to suspicion. Every decision felt personal. Without a mediator, disagreements escalated instead of resolving. The band was now forced to manage itself while already pulling in different directions, creatively and emotionally. And that combination was toxic. Small issues snowballed into permanent fractures. What's most striking is that the breakup didn't begin with anger. It began with uncertainty. No one knew who was in charge anymore. And when leadership disappears inside a business this large, collapse becomes inevitable. The music kept coming, but underneath it, the foundation was already cracking. Apple Corps was supposed to be freedom, a creative sanctuary where artists controlled their own work, free from corporate interference. Instead, it quickly turned into chaos. There were no real rules, no financial discipline, and no experienced leadership running day-to-day operations. Money poured out faster than it came in. Employees were hired without oversight. Projects were approved with no accountability. What started as an idealistic experiment became a financial nightmare. For the Beatles, this was a shock. They were watching millions disappear while being told everything was under control. But it wasn't. Apple didn't just drain money, it drained trust. Every loss raised questions. Who was responsible? Who was making decisions? And who would take the blame when things collapsed? The answers were never clear, and that uncertainty poisoned everything that followed. As Apple bled cash, conversations inside the band changed tone. Arguments were no longer about chords or lyrics, they were about expenses, authority, and responsibility. Creativity started sharing space with resentment. Every member saw the problem differently, and that made unity impossible. Some wanted tighter control, others wanted total freedom. Neither side trusted the other to handle money properly. What made it worse was that success hid the damage from the outside world. Fans saw hit records. Inside, the band saw instability, and once finances enter the room, relationships shift. Every disagreement feels personal. Every compromise feels like loss. The Beatles were still creating legendary music, but beneath it all, the business side was quietly pulling them apart, piece by piece. By this point, each Beatle was evolving in his own direction. What once felt like healthy diversity began to feel like competition. Some wanted polished structure, others wanted experimentation without limits. Collaboration slowly turned into coexistence. Songs were no longer shaped together from start to finish. Instead, they arrived nearly complete, leaving little room for compromise. The studio stopped feeling like a shared space and started feeling divided. No one was wrong, but no one was aligned anymore. And when creative independence grows faster than trust, the result isn't freedom, it's fragmentation. The band still existed, but the glue that once held them together was weakening fast. With Apple in trouble and Epstein gone, the biggest question became unavoidable. Who should manage the Beatles now? This wasn't just about guidance, it was about control. One side wanted a familiar, family-based approach. The others wanted someone aggressive, experienced, and ruthless in business. Neither side trusted the other's choice, and this disagreement wasn't theoretical. Whoever won would control contracts, publishing, finances, and long-term strategy. It was a decision that would lock the band's future for decades. Instead of compromise, lines were drawn. And once sides formed, reconciliation became almost impossible. This wasn't just a dispute, it was a power struggle. The management war changed everything. Meetings became tense, communication became guarded, every suggestion was questioned for hidden motives. Music took a backseat as lawyers, advisors, and contracts filled the space once reserved for creativity. What made this moment so destructive was that it forced the band into opposing camps. Loyalty shifted from us to my side, and once that happened, unity was no longer possible. The Beatles didn't break apart loudly, they fractured quietly, behind boardroom doors, instead of microphones. And from this point on, the breakup wasn't a possibility, it was just a matter of timing. Before we go any further, take a second to like the video and subscribe, because what happens next completely changes how this story has been told for decades. Now here's the question most fans never ask. What if the breakup actually started long before the public ever heard a word? According to later revelations from Paul McCartney, the real turning point happened quietly, behind closed doors. No press releases, no dramatic announcements, just a private moment where everything shifted. The band was still recording, albums were still planned, but internally the future had already cracked. What the world didn't know was that the breakup wasn't approaching, it had already begun. And once that truth is understood, every headline that followed starts to look very different. Long before the public blamed Paul, John Lennon had already made a decision. In private conversations with the band, John expressed that he wanted out. Not a break, not a pause. He wanted a clean separation, but he didn't announce it publicly. Why? Because contracts were still active, negotiations unfinished, and millions were at stake. Speaking too soon could have destroyed legal leverage. So the band agreed. Silence. From the outside, everything looked normal. Inside, the foundation was gone. John had mentally checked out while the machine kept running. This detail alone dismantles the long-held belief that Paul ended the Beatles. The truth is far more unsettling. The end had already been decided, and the world just hadn't been told yet. The decision to stay quiet wasn't emotional, it was tactical. The Beatles were still bound by contracts that controlled albums, royalties, and publishing rights. Any public announcement could trigger lawsuits or financial chaos. So while fans celebrated new releases, the band operated under a shared secret. Meetings became procedural. Sessions became obligations. The joy was fading, replaced by necessity. This silence created a dangerous vacuum where assumptions flourished. Without context, the public filled in the blanks, and when one voice finally spoke, that voice would carry all the blame, regardless of the truth. The longer they waited, the more distorted the story became. When Paul finally spoke publicly in 1970, the timing sealed his fate. To the outside world, it looked like a sudden betrayal, but in reality, Paul was responding to a decision that had already been made months earlier. He wasn't ending the band, he was acknowledging reality. Still, perception mattered more than sequence. Fans saw leadership as dominance, persistence as control, and because Paul kept working, kept pushing projects forward, it looked like he was forcing his will on the group. The nuance vanished. A simplified villain emerged, and once that narrative took hold, it became almost impossible to undo. Paul's announcement didn't end the Beatles. It exposed what had already happened. The band had been operating on borrowed time, held together by legal obligations and fading loyalty. Once the silence broke, there was no reason left to pretend. Lawsuits followed. Relationships hardened, the dream officially ended, but the damage had been done long before. What makes this revelation so powerful is how quietly history was rewritten, not by lies, but by omission. And only now, decades later, are the missing pieces finally falling into place. What haunted Paul McCartney for decades wasn't anger, it was timing. Speaking too early could have detonated lawsuits that would drag on for years. Speaking too emotionally could have poisoned relationships beyond repair. And speaking too honestly might have rewritten history before anyone was ready to hear it. So Paul chose restraint. He focused on survival, rebuilding his career while the Beatles' legal machinery ground forward in the background. Silence wasn't weakness, it was protection. Every word mattered when contracts, publishing rights, and royalties were still unresolved. Paul understood that truth, once released, can't be pulled back, and for a long time, the cost of telling it was simply too high. So the myth remained intact, not because it was accurate, but because it was convenient. The breakup didn't end with an announcement. It triggered years of legal warfare. Lawsuits pitted former bandmates against each other, turning creative partners into opposing parties. At the center were control and money. Who managed the catalog? Who approved releases? Who decided the future of the Beatles' legacy? The business they built together now trapped them apart. What made it worse was that fans rarely saw this side. Court filings aren't romantic. Settlements don't fit into documentaries. But this legal gridlock kept wounds open far longer than the music ever did. Even when albums stopped, the fight didn't. And every unresolved case made reconciliation harder, not easier. Decades later, with nothing left to negotiate and no image left to protect, Paul McCartney finally spoke plainly. He didn't point fingers, he didn't assign blame, he clarified sequence, and that distinction matters. Paul explained that the decision to leave came from John first, privately, internally, long before the public narrative formed. Paul's announcement wasn't a betrayal, it was an acknowledgement. That single clarification doesn't vilify anyone, but it collapses the myth. It forces history to shift from emotion to fact, and for the first time, fans were asked to reconsider not who ended the Beatles, but how the end actually unfolded. Simple stories last longer than complicated truths. Paul broke up the Beatles fit neatly into headlines. It gave fans closure and someone to blame. The real version required patience, context, and uncomfortable nuance. It involved silence, business strategy, and emotional distance, none of which make for satisfying villains. Over time, repetition replaced accuracy. Interviews were clipped, quotes were isolated, and the myth became history by default. What's remarkable isn't that fans believed it, it's that no one challenged it loudly enough to stop it. Until now. Paul didn't walk away first. He held on. He kept recording, planning, pushing forward, because someone had to. And that persistence came at a price. Leadership was mistaken for dominance. Commitment was mistaken for control. In trying to save the band's future, Paul unknowingly secured his role as the villain in its ending. But history, when given time, has a way of correcting itself. And the truth that finally emerged isn't dramatic, it's human. The Beatles didn't end because one man destroyed them. They ended because success outgrew the structure that once held them together. When you strip away decades of blame, headlines, and mythology, the Beatles' breakup stops looking like a betrayal and starts looking like a warning. Creative partnerships don't usually collapse because of one argument or one person. They collapse when growth outpaces structure. By the end of the 1960s, the Beatles were four men evolving faster than the system around them could adapt. Fame magnified every weakness. Money exposed every unresolved disagreement. And without a central figure to balance power, every decision felt like a threat. What makes this story resonate even now is how familiar it is. Success didn't destroy the Beatles. Success revealed what had been quietly breaking for years. That's why Paul McCartney's late-life clarification matters so much. It isn't about shifting blame, it's about understanding process. The end didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived through silence, avoidance, and business decisions that slowly replaced trust. The Beatles didn't fail as artists. They exceeded the limits of the partnership that created them. And in that sense, their breakup isn't a tragedy. It's the inevitable cost of unprecedented success. Once you see it that way, the story stops being about who ended the band and starts being about why no band like them could ever last forever. Long after the lawsuits were settled and the accusations faded, what remained was something far bigger than the breakup itself. The Beatles' music didn't fracture the way their business did. It endured. In fact, the separation may have preserved the legacy rather than diminished it. By ending when they did, the band avoided becoming a shadow of its former self. There were no reunion albums driven by obligation, no tours powered by nostalgia alone. What exists is a complete body of work, finite, intentional, and untouched by decline. That permanence is part of why their influence still feels alive, and it reframes the end not as failure, but as closure. Each member went on to explore identities that were impossible within the group, proving that the Beatles weren't destroyed, they transformed. When Paul McCartney finally clarified the truth decades later, it didn't reopen old wounds, it sealed them. The world didn't need another villain, it needed context. And once context entered the story, the breakup stopped being a mystery and became a lesson in scale, pressure, and human limits. The Beatles outlived themselves because they knew, consciously or not, when the story had reached its final chapter. History doesn't change all at once. It shifts slowly when enough time has passed and the people involved no longer need to protect themselves. That's why the final understanding of the Beatles' breakup could only arrive decades later. When emotions cooled, contracts expired, and reputations no longer hung in the balance, the truth finally had room to breathe. What emerged wasn't a dramatic confession or a shocking accusation, it was clarity. The breakup wasn't caused by ego, jealousy, or one fatal argument. It was the result of an unprecedented situation. Four young men creating something so powerful that no existing system could contain it. When Paul McCartney corrected the timeline late in life, he wasn't rewriting history, he was finishing it. He clarified what had been left incomplete, not to absolve himself, but to restore balance to a story that had leaned too heavily on blame. And once that balance is restored, the ending looks very different. The Beatles didn't collapse under conflict. They dissolved under weight of fame, of business, of expectation. Their silence wasn't deception, it was survival, and their breakup wasn't a failure. It was the moment when the greatest band in history reached the natural limit of what four people could carry together. Once that truth is understood, the story stops feeling tragic and starts feeling inevitable. The timing of this clarification matters just as much as the content. When Paul McCartney speaks now, there's no campaign to sell, no leverage to protect, no rivalry left to manage. The business is settled, the legacy is secure. What remains is perspective, and perspective changes everything. For years, the breakup story was treated like a courtroom drama. Someone had to be guilty, but with distance, the need for a verdict fades, replaced by understanding. The truth doesn't flatten the past, it deepens it. It explains why the band's final years felt both brilliant and brittle, why masterpieces arrived alongside visible strain. It also reframes the idea of leadership and blame. Holding things together can look like control. Staying silent can look like deception. Speaking last can look like confession. None of those impressions capture the reality of managing creativity at a scale no one had faced before. This late-life correction isn't about settling scores. It's about giving fans the full picture so the music can stand on firmer ground. Once the business pressures, legal constraints, and strategic silences are acknowledged, the breakup stops being a scandal and starts being a case study in what happens when art becomes an empire. And that's why this truth lands now, because only now can it be heard without distortion. In the end, the Beatles didn't fall apart the way legends usually do. There was no single villain, no dramatic betrayal that explains everything. What finally ended them was scale. The music grew bigger than the friendships, the business grew heavier than the joy, and the silence required to keep everything afloat grew louder than any argument. When Paul McCartney finally clarified the truth late in life, he didn't destroy the myth to replace it with bitterness. He replaced it with realism. 4 young men created something so massive that it outgrew the very structure that made it possible. No contract, no manager, no amount of loyalty could hold it forever. And that's the part fans rarely consider. The Beatles didn't end because they stopped caring. They ended because caring wasn't enough anymore. The pressure was constant, the expectations were endless, and the cost of continuing began to outweigh the cost of stopping. Once you understand that, the breakup no longer feels like failure. It feels like an unavoidable conclusion to an unprecedented story. The music survived because they chose not to let it decay. The legacy endured because they walked away before compromise replaced brilliance. And the truth, delayed but intact, finally landed where it belongs. Not as scandal, not as blame, but as understanding. That's the real ending of the Beatles.